Dear Sister is a sketch that does quite a lot of competing things within a very, very short amount of time. It's a parody of teen soap opera The OC. It's a tremendously absurd sketch in which the comedic turn happens by the 20-second mark, with the scene only getting weirder from there. And it's a work of comedy filmmaking where the punchlines are images and sound effects rather than words. And we're going to come back to that last one because it's one of The Lonely Island's biggest contributions to the comedy landscape that apparently flew under the radar. This run of Lonely Island shorts, from their early web shows all the way through their time at SNL, is easily my favorite body of work in all of comedy. And Dear Sister, for me, is the moment in which they had absolutely perfected their craft. But the reason I want to talk about Dear Sister in particular is that, in my opinion, the real magic of this sketch is often misremembered in the popular retelling. Much has been written about this sketch, and yet, almost every piece of writing I was able to find points to absurdism as the engine that drives the comedy, often with the argument that absurdist comedy was a uniquely millennial phenomenon, and frankly that's just a bad reading of the history of jokes. So let's course correct a little bit and talk about what makes Dear Sister work at the formal level. Welcome to Computer Lab Hijinks, a show about games, old software, and web ephemera. In this video, we're looking at Dear Sister from Saturday Night Live, and how it used cinematic formalism to convey its central joke. We'll talk about the early years of Lonely Island, the DV revolution and early nonlinear editing tools, and we'll talk about cuts and editing as the formal quality of cinema, and what exactly these things mean in context to Dear Sister. I've wanted to make this video for a very, very long time because the DV revolution is near and dear to my heart, so let's dive right in. For all the ways in which Dear Sister was a parody of one specific plot twist in Season 2 of The OC, this fact is often dismissed as mere background information, an overly serious dramatic scene that The Lonely Island was heightening for comedic effect. But the Dear Sister sketch was doing something quite remarkable with the tone and filmmaking style of The OC. And in a sense, both of these things were successful for the same reason. It is well worth mentioning that The Lonely Island had already done a parody of The OC through their web series The Boo, that used a number of the same jokes in a slightly more grounded way. Slightly more grounded. This wasn't just a random pop culture parody. For one thing, The OC was already over and somewhat forgotten by the time Dear Sister had aired, but crucially, this was a comedy sketch made by 3 filmmakers who understood what The OC was doing at the cinematic level. So let's talk about what that show was. First airing in 2003, The OC was a pretty hard sell as a concept. It was yet another soap opera for teenagers. And in my own research, I found that early critical responses to the show were all over the place. For the New York Times, Alessandra Stanley writes, "Fox's nighttime soap opera about rich, pampered teenagers in Southern California may not be uplifting or groundbreaking, but it amply fills the teen angst vacuum left by Beverly Hills 90210 and Dawson's Creek." At its core, The OC was a drama with a capital D, filled with angsty characters, extramarital affairs, runaway teens who are angry with their parents, and explosive secrets, high-stakes interpersonal conflicts that just keep ramping up with no end in sight. The first season of the show is a really compelling fish-out-of-water story that looks at economic disparity in California in particular, and it's anchored in the incredibly charming performance of Adam Brody as Seth Cohen, who became the clear fan favorite in a cast that was not always great. The OC stood out in the crowded teen soap genre by making 2 crucial decisions. Firstly, the series would have strong directorial control of tone, achieved through single-camera filmmaking and very careful staging and direction, as opposed to the downright ugly multi-camera format of most soap operas. This led to the show's many shots of teens looking sad, characters just staring at each other, with the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. And secondly, the thing that The OC is perhaps most known for, its generous use of musical cues. Scenes were practically defined by their needle drops, playing just the right song at just the right moment, and it's why the show is nearly impossible to separate from its soundtrack. So these are the 2 elements that Dear Sister heightens for comedic effect: foregrounded musical cues and angsty looks. Crucially, both of these techniques are heavily reliant on video editing, and the way the scene is cut together in post-production, rather than having been staged live for a studio audience. And folks, this fact is massively, massively overlooked in popular writing on Dear Sister in particular. For the content farm popsugar.com, Chelsea Hassler writes, April 14, 2007, that was the night that Saturday Night Live debuted Dear Sister, a digital short so inexplicable to our parents that it became instantly clear that there was one hell of a generational divide in our collective senses of humor, and we would never be able to see eye to eye on comedic ground. The argument here is basically, boomers will never understand this hip SNL sketch because they can't wrap their heads around absurdism, which itself is a completely absurd argument. This type of comedy, free from discernible punchlines and divorced from the rules of everyday life, was not new. Donald O'Connor danced on the walls in Singin' in the Rain. A caterpillar smoked hookah in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And if we're going really far back, 3rd century BCE philosopher Chrysippus allegedly died of laughter from watching his donkey drink wine and eat figs. Even within Saturday Night Live itself, the beloved Needs More Cowbell sketch does not have a clear punchline. Will Ferrell simply wrote a scene that fictionalized the recording process of a song that happened to feature an unusual instrument fairly prominently in the mix, and it was funny to watch Will Ferrell swing his hips. That's the entire joke, and it's fantastic. Basically, any argument to the effect of Dear Sister was innovative because of its absurdism, or Dear Sister was popular because millennial comedy, is one that absolutely drives me up the wall. Yes, 2007 felt like a new and strange time because of iPhones and MySpaces, and that feeling of alienation may have left audiences ready to laugh at something that didn't make a whole lot of sense. But here's the twist, we've always lived in new and strange times. The Surrealist movement took the collective trauma of mechanized warfare in World War I and gave us signed urinals in art galleries, theater about two guys waiting for a friend who never shows up, and a painting of what is absolutely not a pipe. All three of these things have late 2000s Tumblr humor written all over them. Reality-bending comedy was not invented by 21st century hipsters. But for all the ways I'm clearly frustrated with this interpretation, there's a version of that argument that I might agree with. Obviously, SNL had made jokes before, but Dear Sister felt like it was telling them in a new way. And it absolutely was. It manipulated time and space in ways that were impossible through the standard multi-camera live comedy show. And that is what this video essay is all about. How Dear Sister used the magic of cinema through the formal quality of cuts and editing to tell a classic absurdist joke in a new way. The sketch opens on two characters, Keith and Dave, having a somber conversation about a letter Keith is writing to his sister. We aren't told much about the location, the relationship between Keith and Dave, why Keith is writing a letter to his sister, or why the scene opens on such a serious tone. As Keith begins explaining the letter to Dave, Dave shoots him, and three very important things happen all at once. We hear a gunshot sound, we cut to an extremely grim sequence of slow motion shots, with the frame rate awkwardly stepped down instead of traditional high frame rate shooting, and the chorus of the song Hide and Seek immediately starts playing. And right off the bat, this moment immediately following the gunshot is something you wouldn't normally see on SNL. Really precise cuts to exact camera setups aren't something the show does particularly well, nor is the playback of sound effects at exactly the right moment. The timing of this joke is exact in a way that Saturday Night Live never is. Also, perhaps more importantly, the continuity of the scene is broken with almost every cut to a new shot. Dave was sitting in a chair, leaning back, calm, with no visible props anywhere, and suddenly he's standing up, looking really angry. He's holding a gun, and the gun is pointed at Keith, having already been aimed and fired. This, of course, makes no logical sense. The ensuing reaction shots, with each character looking over their shoulder at the other person, also break continuity. And this basic pattern of gunshot, slow motion, music cue, and over-the-shoulder head turn is repeated throughout the rest of the sketch. The scene is certainly weird. It's absurdist comedy in the most traditional sense of the term. But crucially, it's a joke they wouldn't have been able to do live. For Vulture, Jesse David Fox writes, "It's easy to knock The Lonely Island for just being in the right place at the right time, but to do so would be to overlook an element of the group's sketches that made them ideal for the internet: editing. The humor is solely in the rhythm of the editing, a rhythm that quickly became the basic pulse of online comedy. And this is perhaps the only article I could find that even hinted at editing in this sketch. Quite simply, this is a short film recorded on DV camcorders and edited in Final Cut Pro, where the jokes are created in the edit. SNL had absolutely aired short films before, like commercial parodies and mockumentaries, but Dear Sister was something quite different. The Lonely Island had taken cinema's ability to compress time and juxtapose contradictory images and applied it at the micro level. From one shot to the next, a character is doing something they weren't doing before, or making a face that is otherwise not motivated by the flow of the narrative. In film studies, this overall style is known as formalism, a type of movie making that doesn't just capture a live performance or tell a linear story, like a stage play, but instead uses cuts and editing, the formal quality of film itself, to create an elusive new thing. The symbolic power of an edit is often explained through, to use a classic film school example, the Kuleshov effect. Basically, this man looking at a can of soup is hungry, this man looking at a coffin is sad, and this man looking at a burning building is probably the guy who set it on fire. They are, of course, the exact same shot of a guy staring blankly ahead, and that strange alchemy is what editing fundamentally does. So if we're talking about how Dear Sister was a uniquely mid-2000s kind of joke, this is where I would absolutely have to agree, but for a very different reason than absurdism or millennial comedy. By 2007, the filmmaking process was changing rapidly in ways that might have gone unnoticed outside of the industry proper. In 1997, the Academy Award for Achievement in Film Editing went to Walter Murch for his work on The English Patient, a film which was cut digitally on Avid Media Composer. This had never happened before, and frankly, I'm surprised that it was allowed to happen at all. For over 100 years, movies were cut with scissors and tape, often with the help of a machine like the Moviola or the much more sophisticated-looking Steenbeck. Two different shots were physically extracted from longer takes, placed next to each other on a long table, and stuck together. But by the turn of the century, digital editing had become accessible to regular people, thanks in large part to Randy Ubilos and his work on Adobe Premiere and Final Cut Pro. Suddenly, a director could cut an entire short film on their laptop over a weekend, at the coffee shop, and with built-in tools for color grading and sound mixing, which had previously required the help of entirely separate post houses. Digital video was still controversial in the industry proper, but that didn't stop up-and-coming artists from doing incredible work with the tools they had available. Arguably, the early works of digital cinema were not feature films, but no-budget short films, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the early online work of The Lonely Island. The music video Just Two Guys, published on a number of early web hosting sites like iFilm, if anyone remembers that, had more in common with a short film than a comedy sketch. It had a strong emphasis on insert shots, smash cuts, stop motion, and guerrilla filmmaking in public places. The comedy in this video comes more from the overall vibe, the general awkwardness of the format and its presentation, than it does from the lyrics of the song, or any discernible punchlines. And this was something that the Lonely Island guys had a very hard time explaining to network executives when they started breaking into the TV industry. Quote, "A lot of our jokes are editing and music based. Ours could never be a stage show. It seems so obvious now, but I remember the people at Comedy Central listening to this and then saying to us, okay, but could you put this up on our live stage so we can see what you're talking about?" That's literally what they said. It is true that these three comedians were in the right place at the right time to have their work go viral in the early days of YouTube, but we need to be clear about what that means. At a time when SNL sketches were 3 cameras pointed at a stage, a live audience reacting to the jokes, and a familiar comedic premise that basically just takes an old vaudeville routine and inserts topical references, Dear Sister was more like an E-Bombs World video that someone accidentally played on national television. To this day, it feels like something that wasn't fully supposed to happen. It was absurd, certainly, but it was also essentially cinematic. A sketch where every new shot had genuine purpose rather than flatly capturing a live show. The point of this video wasn't to shit on sketch comedy, but rather to course correct the narrative we've been telling about The Lonely Island. And just to be clear, I like traditional comedy sketches and even low-concept sitcoms with their bad camera work and obvious laugh tracks. But when we talk about a sketch like Dear Sister within the framework of absurdism or millennial comedy, we're missing the central magic trick that hides in plain sight. Right now, SNL is on its 50th season, and something like half the sketches are now pre-recorded short films. It's probably a holdover from the early days of COVID restrictions that made the regular show impossible, but for whatever reason, they've kept doing it, and in my opinion, the show is better for it. Cuts and editing are not just a cheap way to fix the timing of the scene or take out the bad parts or give the cast members an extra few minutes between sketches, although those things are absolutely a nice bonus. Editing is the central, formal quality of film itself, and when comedians use editing to create the jokes in a scene, they're speaking the language of cinema. And that, I would argue, is the reason why Dear Sister went viral in the early days of YouTube. Thank you for watching this video on The Lonely Island. This is a topic I've been meaning to cover for almost an entire year at this point, but I never found a way to tie it all together. So hopefully this video made some amount of sense. I would love to cover editing and formalism in the future, so if there's any film-related topics you'd like to see, please let me know. As always, thank you for watching Computer Lab Hijinks. I'm Nathan, telling you to keep your files safe, keep your passwords managed, and for goodness sake, don't click on any strange links. We'll see you in a couple weeks.